Good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with Standards Plus History Academy, and today we are beginning Conspirator number 4, LBJ. Question we are looking at today is, why did Texans immediately suspect that LBJ was involved in the JFK assassination? First, it's important to note the influence and the power that LBJ held over the state of Texas in 1963. In the upper left, you see a picture of his ranch. They call it the White House, the Texas White House. The upper right, you've got the National Historical Park named after him. University of Texas has a School of Public Affairs named after him. There's a lake in Texas, as you can see, pretty significant size, named after LBJ. Everywhere you look in Texas, especially back in the 60s and 70s, but I'm sure it's still the case, LBJ looms over the state like some sort of godfather, almost like a crime boss, almost. Here you see a statue in a park, there's a museum, streets are named after him. Bottom right is the picture of his museum, or his presidential museum, which I've always thought was a very odd looking building. Kind of looks like a Xerox machine, a gigantic Xerox machine. Anyway, everywhere you look, and Texans had grown quite familiar with LBJ. He exercised a lot of power, and he brought a lot of money to the state. So one of the ways he exercised his power was what we're going to see as we go through this portion of the series. That LBJ was very astute in understanding that his position of power in the Senate first, and then vice president, and eventually president, helping his state, how that solidified his base. He had power brokers that were very influential in their own right, who cast their lot with him, like Big Oil, for example, some of the big defense contractors, General Dynamics. This guy was a one-man, sort of just a dynamo by himself. Of course, he had this outsized personality as well. He was a big man. You know, he was larger than most men. He used that to his advantage. They call it the Johnson treatment. And he would tower over people and get in their face. He was a close talker, a very profane, loud, close talker, and kind of an intimidating presence. Anyway, Texans, though they probably didn't want to say it out loud, some of them, afraid of him. There was a healthy respect and a healthy fear of LBJ in Texas. Immediately suspected, because they knew him. They knew his ambition. They knew what he's capable of. They knew what he'd already gotten away with. And so it fit the profile of who they had come to know, LBJ as vice president. So let's get into this. Before we start, I just wanted to kind of begin with, and I always do this, with some of LBJ's own words, which, and these are just random quotes from him, but also about him, from people who knew him very, very well. To Claire Booth Luce, remember Claire Booth Luce, the wife of Henry Luce, the owner of Time Life magazine. She asked him, he was majority leader in the Senate. As such, he was one of the most powerful men in Washington. And in the campaign in 1960, when he lost his nominating battle for Democrat nomination with JFK and was extended the VP invitation by JFK, purely for electoral politics reasons. Claire asked him, why on earth would you go from being one of the most powerful men in Washington to being the vice president? And he told her, quote, Claire, I looked it up. 1 out of every 4 presidents died in office. I'm a gambling man, darling, and this is the only chance I got. Bobby Baker, who was his man in the Senate, the fixer, on JFK's inaugural day, Baker predicted that the new president would die a violent death, wouldn't finish his first term. Richard Nixon told Roger Stone, when asked who really killed JFK, said to Roger Stone, quote, Lyndon and I both wanted to be president. The difference was I wouldn't kill for it. Roy Cohn, the famous mob lawyer, said, quote, Lyndon did it. And Madeline Brown, on what LBJ, this was LBJ's mistress. She had a baby with LBJ, the love child, and she was with him the night before the JFK assassination. We'll talk more about that later. And he whispered in her ear, according to Madeline Brown, quote, after tomorrow, those Kennedy sons of bitches will never embarrass me again. That's no threat. That's a promise. So let's go back to the beginning with LBJ. Ambition ran in the family, evidently. When he was born, Sam Ely Johnson, who was his grandfather, said, quote, a U.S. senator is born today. And indeed, in 1948, Johnson did run for Senate. Very famous campaign in Texas. He'd been when he got out, he went to a teacher's college, ironically, became a teacher first, small little rural school, was a cross-country coach, track coach, hated it. There was no money in it, and wanted to get in politics. And so he ran for Congress first, won, and waiting for his opportunity. In 1948, it came, and he had use of a helicopter, which in Texas, when you're running for Senate, it's a statewide deal. Texas is a big state, and it gave him a huge advantage. He whirled around Texas in this whirlybird, landing here, landing there, campaigning like a bat out of hell. And but that's not how he won that election. We'll talk more about that. But anyway, that's the beginning, really, of his political career, 1948, when he bursts on the national scene. Upper right, pictured with Rayburn, Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House, sort of his mentor, his political mentor. I told you about the Johnson treatment. This is them poking fun at it, but this is a pretty effective tool that he used. His physical size and his domineering presence, his intimidating voice, and his colorful language. He would back you into a corner and get in your face and just start, you could smell his breath, and he'd just start jawboning you and lean down over you, and you would find yourself backing up and bending over backwards. And pretty soon you were giving in just to whatever you wanted, just to get him out of your face. This is how he got Chief Justice Earl Warren to serve on the Warren Commission. Warren didn't want to serve on that Warren Commission. Johnson gave him the treatment. So let's talk about that election. We could talk all day about his birth, his childhood and all that stuff. I'm not really interested in that. I want to talk about the election in 1948. This is when it all begins for LBJ. And this is why Texans, when the assassination happens 15 years later, their default response was Lyndon was involved somehow, some way. Lyndon was involved. And he earns a nickname through this election. They call him Landslide Lyndon, You'll see why here. It's a term of irony, of course. Um, George Parr, pictured here on the right, is nicknamed the Duke of Duval. And there's a county in southern Texas called Duval County. And bosses like this would control the party machine. Of course, this is a solid South. So everyone who's anybody's a Democrat. You're not going to win anything as a Republican in those days, in the South. So the Democrat Party is pretty much a one-party state. So George Parr pretty much is the guy in control of the Democrat Party machine in southern Texas, including Duval County, which is where a lot of this that we're going to be talking about takes place. And down in that part of Texas, the leverage instrument that you had if you were a boss like Parr was getting the Mexicans to vote the way you wanted them to vote, for whom you wanted them to vote. And you could use a combination of violence or money, bribes, whatever it took. Bribe understood that part of the world, understood the people down there, and understood how to get people to vote the way he wanted them to vote. And so if you are running for statewide election, like Lyndon Johnson is at 48, you go to these kinds of people. It's kind of like what Kennedy did in West Virginia. In West Virginia, you went to the county sheriffs. You paid them off. And the sheriffs made everything work for you in West Virginia. In Texas, it was the bosses, the Democrat Party bosses like this. Luis Salas was the deputy sheriff, and he was the Parr enforcer. So Parr could use a carrot or a stick. If they used money, no doubt Parr was the one handing out the cash. But if he needed something accomplished through the stick, he used the sheriff, or in this case, the deputy sheriff. Luis Salas said, quote, "We had the law to ourselves there. It was a lawless son of a bitch. We had iron control. If a man was opposed to us, we put him out of business. Parr was the godfather. He had life or death control." So on election day, after the votes were initially counted, Johnson was losing after the first vote count. And this is a trick that the folks that supported Johnson came up with. I don't think they came up with it, but they mastered it for sure. And what they would do is they would hold out certain counties until they knew what the vote tally was everywhere else. They'd see, okay, we're behind and we need this many votes. So all of a sudden, Parr, quote, finds 427 more votes in Duval County, which puts LBJ now in the lead. So anytime you have a vote count that's this close, it's going to trigger an automatic recount. So they have another recount, and this time he's losing. And this is the Democrat nomination for who's going to be the Democrat candidate. It doesn't really matter. This is the real election. Once you get to the general, and it's the Democrat versus the Republican, everybody knows the Democrat's going to win. So this is a fight between two Democrats. All of a sudden, after the second recount, Parr finds more votes for LBJ, but he's still behind. Stevenson's up by 157 votes. And by this point, Parr can't go back to the well in Duval County anymore. It's maxed out. So he goes to a neighboring county and he finds 200 more votes for LBJ in a famous box that they call Box 13 in Jim Wells County. They just magically appear. This could have gone on all day, folks. This is what they did. The vote count tally would be made, and then that's when the cheating began. And Parr would find votes, and then they'd recount. He'd be losing again. He'd find more votes, and he'd be losing again. Recount, find more votes. And they just keep doing it. They just keep finding more votes until you've exhausted. And if you're smart, you wait until your opponent has turned in all the votes from his parts of the state, which vote for him. And then you are tardy with yours from your part of the state that would support your candidate. And you just find out what you got somebody on the inside tells you what the numbers are. And then you just keep finding more votes to beat those numbers. These are the guys that made this election possible for Lyndon Johnson. He ends up winning the election by 87 votes. That's why they call him Landslide Lyndon. And George Parr's pictured here, Louis Salas. These are the folks that stole the election for Lyndon Johnson in 48. You say, well, how do you know he stole it? Might it have been legitimate that all those things just happened the way they happened? In 1952, Sam Smithwick, who was one of Parr's deputies, wrote Coke Stevenson, and he said, I will testify against LBJ for what happened in 48. And he was in a jail cell at the time. He'd been arrested on something else. And the next day, or the night before Stevenson was to meet with him, and he was going to tell a story, he was found hanging in a cell, was ruled a suicide. This is going to become a real common theme with people that become threats to LBJ. They just turn up dead. And they're always ruled suicides, almost always. He had, by the way, he was serving a life sentence for for killing somebody. So he was in jail, and he wrote Coke Stevenson. He says, I have some information. So no doubt he was trying to get some treatments, make a deal of some sort. But it's interesting what happened to him. In 1973, George Parr admitted to his attorney that LBJ had spoken to him after the election, and they'd found out they were still trailing by 157 votes. And he told Parr he needed 200 more votes to win. This is, again, about the 48 election. 2 years later, Parr himself, the former boss of Southern Texas and Duval County, is found dead and slumped over the wheel of a running vehicle, with a bullet hole on the right side of his head. This is suicide number 2. So here we have, as a result of the election of 48, 2 of the people that facilitated the stealing of that election for LBJ have now turned up dead. In both cases, they had stories to tell that incriminated LBJ in the stealing of that election. In both cases, they died within a short period. In both cases, they were ruled suicides. In 1977, Louis Salas, the enforcer for George Parr, admitted under oath that he had helped Parr and LBJ orchestrate the ballot stuffing of Box 13. He said, quote, Johnson didn't win that election. It was stolen for him. You see the picture of those tapes down there in the bottom right as he testified under oath in a deposition. So this is the third individual from that 48 election that were on LBJ's side. They were insiders. All 3 now have incriminated LBJ in the stealing of that election. 2 of them are dead. This is a compilation, a couple news articles here indicating Parr's and Louis Salas's roles in helping. It just tells the whole story and how the Jim Wells count provided the margin, the final margin, because they needed 200 more votes from a neighboring county. So if you're doing the math, this, quote, Duval County incident, we've had 3 people now involved in the rigging of this election. All 3 have come forward with stories, all similar stories, all saying the same thing, implicating LBJ, and 2 of them are dead. Actually, all 3. I misspoke. So two are dead by gunshot, one by hanging. Smithwick hung himself in the cell. Salas and Parr were both found dead by gunshots. So I started off today asking the question, why did Texans immediately suspect that LBJ was involved in the JFK assassination? His introduction to politics. A lot of people, you hear these stories of corruption in politics, especially down in like the deep South, like Louisiana, for example. And these kind of stories are pretty common, right? Uh, Rigging elections, people turn up dead, et cetera, et cetera. Normally, it's an old hand Politico, been around forever. That's how he consolidates his power. He runs everything, and everyone's under his tight control. Very rarely do you see it from the very beginning. Normally, you have to work to that point. LBJ, this is his first big election as far as the Senate is concerned, statewide. He's represented a district before. This is statewide. And he is coming in strong right from the get-go and steals the election and then just systematically eliminates everybody who knew anything about it. And at some point, I think I've mentioned this before, I've stopped believing in coincidences, and when it comes to matters of scandal, and political intrigue, I just don't believe in coincidences anymore. And you'd have to be pretty, I think, naive to believe all three of these died, having the same story to tell, having worked on the same campaign, all implicating the same person. All three ended up all three by suicide, allegedly. You just have to be naive, I think, to believe that there wasn't some hanky-panky going on here. And of course, Texans have made that same determination. By the time we get to 63, they know who Lyndon is. In 1956, this is the beginning of the feud between the Kennedy family and Johnson. Joe Kennedy Sr. went to LBJ and asked him to consider running for the Democrat nomination and to put JFK on the ticket as his running mate. A lot of people don't know the story. And Joe's motives were not altruistic in this. There was no love lost between him and LBJ. He knew whoever ran 56 was toast. They were going to lose. He wanted to use LBJ as a sacrificial lamb to take the loss, because Eisenhower was going to win re-election. There was no doubt. Go out there, run, take the loss, but elevate the status of his son by nominating him to be his vice president so that he would be the heir apparent of the next guy in line to run in 60. He was setting it out for his son is what he was doing, trying to gain exposure for Jack so he could run in 60. LBJ would always be the one saddled with the loss. When in my lifetime, and this is true when you think back, when you think about the losing presidential candidates, in most of these cases, I can't remember who the VP nominee was. Let's see, when Reagan ran against Carter. Now, I didn't vote in that election. Obviously, you know who the winners were, Reagan and Bush. Carter, I'd have to think about who his vice president was. 4 years later, when Reagan ran against Mondale, 84, I know who Mondale's VP candidate was because it was a woman, and it was unusual for Geraldine Ferraro, right? That sticks out in my mind because it was a unique selection. But ordinarily, I mean, you could go in 88 when Bush ran against Dukakis. I have no idea who Dukakis. Oh, it was Benson, wasn't it? Lloyd Benson, I think. I think it was Lloyd Benson. I'm not positive though. You see what I mean? The losing candidate gets saddled with the loss. Hillary, when she ran, it's recent enough. I remember the last one, 16, it was Kane from Virginia. But my point in saying this is everybody remembers the losing ticket, the top of the ticket, not the bottom of the ticket. And so that's what Joe was counting on. LBJ will take the loss, and Jack will be set up to be the next candidate for president on the Democrat side. LBJ was smart enough to decline the offer because he knew Eisenhower was unbeatable, and I think he knew what Joe's ulterior motives was. And so Kennedy, Joe Kennedy Sr., was furious with LBJ, and he was used to getting his way. And of course, his ambition is to help his son. And Bobby, who was very sensitive about his father and the way he felt about things. I mean, you're going to see this time and time again. If there is a slight, it's interesting. Bobby himself, we talked about the King Henry thing about the poisoned inheritance. Bobby wanted to clean up his family's name because of what his daddy had done to the family name. But he's an insider. He's a family member, and he can hold his dad to an account. But he didn't like it when somebody from outside the family did. Oh no, them were fighting words. And so he's very defensive of his dad. And his dad wanted this to happen. It didn't happen. His daddy blamed LBJ. And so Bobby blamed LBJ. Later, when LBJ insults his daddy with some things about his daddy's past, Bobby's furious. He flies off the handle. Bobby was very defensive of his dad and very defensive of the family name, and later very defensive and protective of his brother. Bobby had that thing about him. If he was a bigger guy, he could have been a good offensive lineman, football, because he was a protector. And he had a very strong protective instinct. And in this case, he saw his daddy's anger, and he sort of adopted that same position towards LBJ. And it's going to stay with him. Bobby's never going to like LBJ, ever. In 1959, Bobby traveled to LBJ's ranch to see if he planned to run for president in 1960. So now he's been sent by his daddy on a fact-finding mission. And they all know, the Kennedys do, who their main competition is for a Democrat nomination. It's LBJ. Well, LBJ lies to him and says, "No, I'm not planning to run." So this clears the path, at least Kennedys think, for JFK to run. And then LBJ did something that Bobby never forgot. He took Bobby hunting, and he gave Bobby one of his hunting rifles to use that had a real powerful kick to it. He did it intentionally. And when Bobby fired, it knocked him back on his ass on the ground. And he cut his head open on the way down. He was bleeding. LBJ stood over him and laughed, saying, quote, "Son, you got to learn how to handle a gun like a man." He stood over. I just see him laughing, shaking his head. He's got his cowboy hat on. He's 6'5", probably 6'9" with his hat on, just towering over little Bobby. And of course, Bobby's this Northeastern liberal. He probably still has his dress shoes on, his dress pants on. And he came down into LBJ's world, and LBJ stuck it to him. First, he lied to him, and then he insulted him. Here's the insult that I told you about. In the 1960 campaign, he begins publicly mocking Joe Kennedy Sr. for his appeasement of Hitler during World War II, or during the lead up to World War II. And we told that story, how he was U.S. ambassador in London, and he had made some public statements on behalf of Hitler before the war broke out. Yeah, of course, it embarrassed FDR, and FDR had to replace him. And that ended Joe Sr.'s political career. The war went on to become World War II, and Hitler went on to become Hitler. And all of a sudden, anybody who had any kind words to say about Hitler, anything, um, any defense of Hitler prior to the war, now looks like an appeaser. They all get lumped into the same category. And of course, Joe Sr. and Neville Chamberlain were kind of, they sought each other's advice. And so Neville Chamberlain got smeared with the appeaser label. So naturally, Joe Kennedy would as well. So this is an easy insult. Everybody understands it. And, 1960, the war has only been over 15 years. So it's still relatively fresh. So LBJ says, quote, I was never any Chamberlain umbrella policy man. I never thought Hitler was right. And this is an insult to Joe Sr. Directly, but indirectly, it's an insult to Jack Kennedy, who's running against him in the 60 campaign to get the nomination, basically calling him out, saying all the Kennedys are the same, And LBJ also went public with what he had found out, and it was actually true. The Kennedys were trying very hard to keep this information from the American people. That was JFK's poor health. And he did have poor health, extremely poor health. Addison's disease, back problems. He was in pain all the time. He's doped up on meds all the time. And he said JFK was dying of Addison's disease. A couple years prior, when he was in the Senate, he and Bobby had taken a trip over to Indonesia to study, or to Southeast Asia, basically, to study all the Southeast Asia problems over there, Vietnam and Indonesia, et cetera, et cetera. And which really later made his policies that were related to that part of the world informed policies, because he'd been there and he'd been enmeshed in that culture long enough to know what was going on there. And that it was a really smart thing to do. It was preparation for a presidential run. He was trying to educate himself on that part of the world, but he almost died while he's over there. He spent some time in the hospital. He literally almost died. The Kennedy family thought he was going to die. There was talk that they were preparing to have a priest flown over there to administer last rites. I mean, it was that dire. So LBJ's not talking out of school here. He's not making something. It's true. JFK did have poor health, but the Kennedys were furious, and because they didn't want this information getting out. Back then, that could decide people's votes. I don't want to vote for somebody who might die in office. So, of course, Bobby, who's pretty much running JFK's campaign in conjunction with his father, responded accusing the Johnson people, quote, running a stinking damned campaign and threatening him, you're going to get yours when the time comes. I can just see Bobby railing at LBJ. And so there is no love lost between the LBJ side and the Kennedy side. No love lost at all. LBJ's already turned down Joe Sr. once in 56. He's lied to Bobby in 60. He insulted him, threw him on the ground with his gun. I wish I could have seen that. And now he's running around spilling the family business. He's airing their dirty laundry out for everybody to see in the campaign. The campaign was pretty dirty. Bobby Kennedy thought LBJ was, quote, an animal. And indeed, if you knew LBJ's personal peccadillos and all the stories that came out of the White House later, the guy was an animal. I mean, he was just he wasn't borderline obscene. He was obscene. He was profane, obscene, grotesque, a bully. I mean, if there's a negative trait, he had it. He had it. LBJ didn't like Bobby either. He said, I'll slit his throat. It's the last thing I do. That is a very prophetic statement. When you think ahead to 68, what happened to Bobby. Anyway, I'll slit his throat. It's the last thing I do. Jackie Kennedy hated LBJ. I never liked Lyndon Johnson. I never trusted him. Years later, after after her kids were grown, and somebody had asked Jackie about LBJ and that famous photo of her standing in Air Force One while LBJ's taking the oath of office, and her husband's lying in a casket in the back of the plane, and they hauled her up there in her little pink suit, still got blood all over the front of it. And she looks like she's in shock, and she clearly was, and she admitted that. But she also said her skin was crawling because she could not stand standing next to this guy, this man, whom she suspected was involved with her husband's assassination. And the body's not even cold yet. It's still warm in the back of the plane. And he's hauled her up there and made her stand there for that picture. There's just no love loss between the Kennedys and LBJ. So the public story of how they end up on the same ticket, I grew up pretty naive thinking that when a president picks somebody to run on the ticket with them, it's because they're friends, they're allies. They're going to work together. They must be. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is part of my education, learning. This is all about politics. Anyway, the public story that came out of the 60 DNC convention, JFK wins the nomination, but it had been a bruising nominating fight. And he knew, the Kennedy side knew, being from the Northeast and a liberal, and most of the constituency in the Democrat Party was in the South, was generally considered to be conservative. And it's like, how am I going to get South to vote for me in the general? So his calculus, he had already decided on who he was going to offer. He had already made an offer to another candidate. He had already made the offer. But as they're doing the calculus, they're realizing the position they're in, it became more and more apparent they needed the guy they made an offer to was from the Mid-South. They needed somebody from the Deep South. And so he decides, and Bobby was not present when he made this decision. Bobby found out about it and about lost his mind. But he decides to offer LBJ the VP slot, thinking he would turn it down because he'd already turned it, he'd already turned Kennedy's down once before in 56. And he thought it would come across as an insult. And LBJ would, no way, I'm not taking that. Anyway, he tells his brother, and his brother hesitantly goes and makes the offer. He responds back to his brother JFK. He says, "You won't believe it. He wants it." So the Kennedys misplayed their hand here if they thought LBJ was going to turn it down. And RFK is just horrified. Oh my God. Now what do we do? JFK says to his brother, now what do we do? So Bobby, they're in the same hotel at the convention. He goes back to LBJ's suite twice in an effort to talk him out of it. But LBJ, once he had heard from JFK's mouth that the offer was there, once that offer had been extended by JFK himself, it didn't matter what RFK said. He didn't care what Bobby said. He said, he kept patronizing Bobby, say something to the effect, well, now, I would not want to be the man who said no to the nominated candidate from my party, like he was doing JFK and Bobby a favor. And he just decided he was going to do it. And that's the public story, that the Kennedys boogered up and asked him, thinking he would turn it down. But that way they could go out and tell everybody, we asked LBJ and he said no. And that would give him an excuse to go back to his preferred candidate. But the real story was that J. Edgar Hoover and LBJ ran a power play on the Kennedys. And what they did is Hoover, who was LBJ's best friend, gave blackmail information to LBJ, photos. And this isn't the last time he'll use this against the Kennedys. And LBJ used these against JFK to say, basically, you're going to make me your running mate, or I'm going to go public with these photographs, whom he that he got from his buddy J. Edgar Hoover. Now, I mentioned that JFK had already offered it to Stuart Symington. And Symington was thinking about it. He was on the verge of accepting the offer. He may have accepted the offer. I don't remember if he had actually accepted it yet, but he's made the offer, and he's going to have to rescind the offer. And it just killed JFK. He says, "I must do something that I have never done before. I made a serious deal, and now I have to go back on it. I have no choice." LBJ and Sam Rayburn, his political mentor from the state of Texas, who taught him everything he knows, they took these photos to JFK and they said, "Hey, this is the deal, buddy. You're going to make LBJ the VP candidate." And JFK didn't have a choice. He was not in a strong enough position to be able to ignore being blackmailed. So he had to call Stuart Symington back, rescind the offer, and that's when he made the offer to LBJ, and LBJ gladly accepted. Famous quote by LBJ: "Power is where power goes." This is his way of saying, "Yeah, I'm just a step down from being Senate Majority Leader, but as he indicated earlier to Claire Booth Luce, he's playing the odds. One out of every 4 presidents does not finish his term in office. He dies." And he's gone back and he's looked at the previous presidents and where they're at in that order, and he realizes we're due. We're due. And I would be the heir apparent. And of course, this is all blind ambition. LBJ wants to be president. He wants it so bad he can taste it. And when he sets his mind to something, he'll stop at nothing. There's no moral or ethical boundaries he won't cross. We've already seen that in 48. He cheated in the election. And then 3 of the people that helped him cheat, when they went public with their story, all ended up dead. And he skates. But the people of Texas notice. The people of America don't. We don't even know him. He's from the state of Texas, and he's Texas's problem. But now he's our problem. And he's going to do nationwide what he's already been doing in Texas. And the Texans know this. So after he wins the nomination, JFK, as I indicated, asks LBJ to be his running mate. And of course, it stunned Bobby. And Bobby had grown to really, really hate LBJ. One of the things LBJ said, he was very bitter about losing that nominating battle to JFK. Jack was out kissing babies while I was passing bills. Basically playing, he's trying to highlight JFK's weaknesses. The blackmail is to stick in JFK's face the knowledge, hey, I know, LBJ is saying, I know about you and all these women. And any time I can use this against you. And he's already used his daddy's appeaser label against the Kennedy family to smear the Kennedys. Now he's using age and experience. Jack was kissing babies while I was passing bills. In other words, he's been doing the work of government while Jack's out there running for office all the time. And you can see that picture on Time magazine cover there. LBJ is the one. This is the Democrat field. You got LBJ in the top right. Some pretty influential guys running. Top left, that's Hubert Humphrey. Bottom middle is JFK, obviously. But JFK won, he won the votes. So he got the nomination. So LBJ, doing what he does, is surviving and waiting, to fight another day. And he's angling for something. And he's thinking about, that comment that he made to Claire Booth Luce is indicative of a thought process of the future and what could happen and what has happened in the past. And he'll just have to suck it up for a couple of years. But eventually he's going to be president. And this is the path. So this is one of those tickets that, they always talk about balancing the ticket. So you have JFK on the right, who's from the Northeast. You have LBJ on the left, who's from the Deep South. You have JFK, who's a Northeastern liberal. And then LBJ is a typical Southern conservative Democrat. JFK is our youngest president at that time. LBJ has some age and experience, has a few miles on the tires. So you got the age thing covered. You got the region thing covered. You got the experience thing covered. And of course, from a temperament standpoint, they couldn't be more opposite. JFK was a cool customer. Sometimes just to get a kick out, I'll get on YouTube and I'll pull up some of his old press conferences and listen to his interaction with the media. He had a very self-deprecating sense of humor. He didn't take himself too serious, even though he was a serious guy, very well-educated guy. He's a powerful guy, right? Comes from a very elite background, family. A guy like that could take himself seriously and lord that over. He just didn't come across that way at all. Came across kind of like a regular guy, very empathetic, very sympathetic, funny, genuinely funny. As I said, self-deprecating, chill. I don't know what students mean by that nowadays. I mean, I have my suspicions what it means, but every now and then I hear my students describe somebody as chill. He's chill. Sometimes I'll say that about different teachers. He's chill. And I think it's a compliment. I'm not completely sure. I'm an old man compared to these kids nowadays, but if I have interpreted it accurately, I would use the same word to describe JFK. He's chill. He's chill. And he had just a real good rapport with people, even his enemies. He had a way. Just his temperament was even keel. He didn't get shook real easily. He didn't get too high, too low. He certainly didn't overreact to things. He wasn't a hothead. Cuban Missile Crisis proved that, right? Everything I just said about Kennedy, turn it around 180 degrees, and that's LBJ. Hothead, bully, used intimidation, profane, crass. Kennedy could use colorful language. Kennedy could be off color, but he did it in such a way that he didn't feel like it was who he was. That's just who LBJ was. And obviously, when you've stooped to the level he already has, like in the 48 election and the aftermath there, he's willing to do anything. He didn't have any ethical or moral boundaries or, guardrails. It's all about power, a lust for power with LBJ. So if I could say something to Jack, and I'm sure he and Bobby are already aware of this to some degree, I would tell him, if I were able to do that and he was still alive and this was happening in real time, I'd say, watch your back, Jack. Watch your back. Some pretty famous situations where that temperament, that difference in temperament, Jackie used to, it was horrifying to Jackie. She'd cover her eyes. They'd be at campaign events. Oh God, he's doing it again. And here you see, he's yelling at somebody, a heckler. They're campaigning for president and he's yelling at somebody. Jack's trying to calm him down. Lyndon, it's okay, man. It's okay. And here you have Lyndon with that look. He had that look, and here he is peering over Jack's shoulder. And he's got that slanty-eyed look in his very cynical expression. And that's why I would tell Jack, that would be my advice to him, is to watch your back, because Lyndon is in it for Lyndon. He is not in it for the ticket. He's not in it for Jack. He's not in it for the Kennedys. He's not even in it for the party. He's in it for himself. This is all a vehicle by which he can attain what he wants, which is to be president. That's his goal. And he'll stop at nothing, as you will see as we go. And see, the Texans know this about him. You know, they were introduced to him and what he's capable of in the 48 election and a little bit aftermath. This is 15 years later. They've had plenty of time to get used to this guy. They know who he is. They know what he's about. And everywhere he goes, dead bodies fall around. It sounds like a politician that we all know today, who everywhere she goes, there's a trail of dead bodies behind her. And again, I don't believe in coincidence. The same is true of London. I mean, we already know of 3, but that's not all. There's going to be more. To the extent that Lyndon is going to have on his payroll, is going to have at his disposal his own personal hitman, which we'll get into next week, but to do his bidding, to do his dirty work. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. So that is the introduction to Conspirator number 4. Just a little background and how he got to be the VP nominee, the vice president under JFK. They were not friends, but we told that story. So this is, again, we started off today with the question, why did Texans immediately suspect LBJ in the assassination of JFK? They just knew he had something to do with it. They didn't know what he did or what his role was, but they knew based on his track record. And all I've done today is lay out the beginning of that track record. And we're going to continue catching you up to speed on that so you can see what the Texans saw back then when they looked at LBJ. He was there. He was a son of a bitch, but he was their son of a bitch. So anyway, that gets us started on Conspirator number 4. And that is episode 89, I believe. So anyway, check out my website, sphistory.com, and feel free to give me a thumbs up and hit the notification bell. Subscribe to the channel. It's free. And feel free to leave a comment if you have anything else to add about LBJ and his start in politics. And we'll continue with this theme tomorrow. Thank you. Have a great day.